Hello, I am from Koenig Solutions, working on SharePoint and Microsoft.NET technologies. Today I am going to talk about secondary workflows in SharePoint. Before we go ahead and start creating a secondary workflow in SharePoint Designer, let's have a look at a high-level conceptual overview of SharePoint workflows. What is a workflow? What is workflow template? Association between a workflow and a list, and what is workflow instance. What is a workflow? So a workflow is a reactive program, typically represents a set of instructions used to capture or automate a specific business process. Workflows are episodic in nature. That means after every episode with a short little burst of activities, there is a longer period of inactivity where the workflow pauses for some kind of external user input or some external event to occur, and then it continue executing rest of the stages within the workflow. So a workflow must be resumable also. So you have to take care while creating a workflow using SharePoint Designer or using Visual Studio. So a workflow must be resumable also. SharePoint workflows. We can create SharePoint workflows using Visual Studio.NET or SharePoint Designer. But SharePoint comes with out-of-box workflows also. Like we have approval workflows, disposition workflows, signature collection workflows, etc. You can create your own custom workflows using Visual Studio.NET or SharePoint Designer. SharePoint, being a full-fledged content management system, provides out-of-the-box workflows to support full document lifecycle automation. So we have full lifecycle of document. Information workers author their documents and upload respective documents in SharePoint repository, whereas immediate managers, approvers or reviewers assigned with approval responsibility, they review the document and approve the documents. So once a document is approved, it is published for public viewing. So a published document stay there for public viewing for a while, and when it expires, the document moves to archive or maybe dispositioned after a while. Let's consider an example where we have employee performance review library as a primary list, which has a primary workflow associated with it. As soon as a user adds the performance review document to this primary document library, this in turn fires the primary workflow. So this primary workflow has assigned a to-do item activity, which adds an item or in fact a task in the secondary task list and assign that task to appropriate reviewer. And as soon as it adds an item or the task in the task list and assign it to appropriate reviewer, it pauses at that point. And here in the secondary list, in this particular task list, we have a secondary workflow defined. So this secondary workflow gets fired as soon as it encounters an addition of an item in a task list. So this secondary workflow first verifies whether this item has been added by appropriate workflow or not, because you may have multiple workflows defined on this list. So we have to verify whether this particular item has been added by a specific primary workflow. We can verify this with the help of properties like workflow list ID, workflow item ID, workflow name. So these properties are propagated automatically to the task list only. So make sure the secondary list has to be a task list or a derived task list. Only then this secondary workflow can get these propagated properties available over here. So with the help of these propagated properties like workflow name, you can identify which actual workflow, which primary workflow has actually added this item. So once the item has been added, This in turn fires the secondary workflow. Secondary workflow checks which workflow has added this item and then takes appropriate action. What action? You need to update the due date. You need to update the due date of the task added over here. So this secondary workflow updates the due date, which could be few days later the addition of a new task or assignment of a new task. So once this task has been added over here and the due date has been set by the secondary workflow, this workflow goes to sleep. And this sleep, or in fact this secondary workflow, wakes up only when the due date arrives of that particular task. On due date arrival, this secondary workflow continue executing rest of the steps, which in turn verifies the status of the task, whether the task has been completed or not. If the task is completed, then the secondary workflow stops. If it doesn't, then it sends an email notification to appropriate reviewer. Now we have got a fair understanding of what is secondary workflow. Let's go and create secondary workflow in SharePoint. Now I'm going to demonstrate you how to create a secondary workflow using SharePoint Designer. And here I'm using a team site. So in this browser window, I'm logged in as Kim on my team site running under port 100 web application. So Kim is an information worker and responsible to upload employee performance report in performance reports document library. This performance reports document library has a primary workflow associated with it, which assigns a task to the approver, Brian. So a new task will be added by the workflow to the Brian's task list. So I already have created a primary workflow called review performance with the help of SharePoint Designer, which has only one step of action to add a task to our approver, Brian. So I have added an action, assigned a to-do item and given it a name, review performance report, and assigned to our approver, Brian. So this is a primary workflow created on performance reports document library. Now we need to create a secondary workflow which gets triggered as soon as a new task has been added to the task list of Brian. So I'm going to use SharePoint Designer over here to create a new workflow, and I'm going to call this workflow due date reminder, and this workflow will be associated with the task list, and as soon as a new task item has been created by the primary workflow, this workflow will trigger and update the due date by a specific period, so that when the new due date arrives, the workflow will continue executing rest of the steps and send a reminder or a notification to the approver that please approve the document. But before that, we need to verify whether the task item has been added by a specific primary workflow, because there are chances that in this task list there may be multiple tasks added by different other workflows, but we have to make sure that this secondary workflow will only fire or will only continue only if the task has been added by primary workflow. So we are going to call this step verify primary workflow, and I'm going to add a condition compare tasks field. Of course, you can only assign secondary workflow to the task list, and it can be a secondary workflow because of the properties like workflow item ID, workflow list ID, and workflow name, which are propagated from primary workflow to the secondary workflow. So you can see over here the actual item ID from the primary list is propagated over here, and the actual list ID, primary list ID, and also the primary workflow name. So we need to verify whether the workflow name is same as the primary workflow. If it is not, then we need to stop the secondary workflow here only. So I verify over here, workflow name not equals, my primary workflow is review performance. So if the primary workflow which has added this task item is not equal to review performance, that means it has been added by some other workflow. If it is not added by primary workflow, then we need to stop the workflow over here itself and log a message that the task item not created by review performance, which is our primary workflow. But if this condition fails, that means if the workflow name is same as the primary workflow, then it should continue executing rest of the steps. So I need to add one more step over here. So I'm going to call this step get the due date and wait, and without any condition, because this step will only execute if the primary workflow is verified, and we need to add an action. If you find the required action in the list, it's good. If not, you can go for more actions, and here you can find different other actions, possible actions which can be added in the workflow. So here I need to update our due date field with a new due date by adding some more time or days to the due date. So I say add time to date, and for the simplicity of this demonstration, instead of adding days etc., I'm adding few minutes over here. Let's say 20 minutes to the due date, which we are going to pick over here from the lookup window. So the source is current item. Current item means the task item itself, and in the task item we have a field called due date. Right? So another 20 minutes will be added to the due date, and we need to store this value in one of our new variable, and I'm going to call this variable due date variable, and make sure it's of date and time type. And in addition to this action, once the due date is updated, we need to add few more actions, like set the field in current item. So set the field is due date to the value coming out of our workflow data, and we have a variable called due date variable which we created in one of our previous action. And then we need to put this workflow to pause. So I don't see pause until date action over here, so I need to go to more action and look for different other actions over here. So you see we have pause for duration, pause until date. So I say pause until date and add, and until this particular time. What time? I need to pick the due date field from the current item, which was already updated by one of our previous step. Once the workflow is put to pause, it will wait till this due date and activate again once the due date arrives. So we need to add one more step over here. So on due date arrival, we need to verify the task status and send the reminder if the task is not completed. So I call it verify task status and send reminder. I need to put a condition over here, compare task field. If the task field completed equals yes, then we need to add an entry in the log history, and we say task completed. But what if the task is not completed? Then we need to send the reminder to our approver. This is the goal of secondary workflow, of course. So we need to add an else branch over here. If this task is not completed, then go ahead, perform some other actions. So I need to send an email, and send an email to, you can put Brian directly over here because we know Brian is the approver, or you can make a lookup also. So when you try to perform a lookup, you can identify on the current task item to whom it is assigned. So subject is performance review due today, and you can put any meaningful message over here. So I say please review performance. Now we need to add a title over here, title of the actual document in our primary list. So primary list is performance reports. So from the performance reports, which is other list than the task list, and we need to pick the title of the document in performance reports document library, and how we are going to identify which particular document has actually initiated this entire sequence of workflows. So we need to verify it with the help of by comparing performance reports ID with our current items workflow item ID. So remember, we talked about some propagated properties like workflow item ID, workflow name, and workflow list ID. So here you can compare this workflow item ID with the performance reports, our primary list item ID itself. And this comparison will actually perform a join operation behind the scene to grab the title from performance reports. And we are done with the message itself, and this will be the last step in our secondary workflow. And we need to compile this secondary workflow now. Once it is compiled and added to the task list, we are now ready to act as skim and upload a new performance document over here. So I add a new document. So this will launch Microsoft Office Word 2007, just to simulate that information worker is uploading a performance report. So I say some performance data goes here, and just to make sure that the title will also be communicated in the email with the help of document information panel, I'm going to pass in the title, and title says it's Jeff performance report. And now I'm ready to save it and in fact upload it in our performance reports document library. Let's simply call it Jeff performance report and save. Just to make sure that document has been uploaded, let's go back to GIMP's browser window, and it refreshes itself. So you can see over here the performance document has been uploaded, and the workflow, primary workflow review performance is in progress. That has actually added a task to the task list, and due date reminder is put to pause. So either Brian logs in and review this document and carry on the workflow by submitting or completing this task, or if he doesn't, then he get the email notification by the due date. Now suppose Brian has not reviewed the document by the due date, so the secondary workflow will fire behind the scene on the task list. So after a waiting for the due date, it will come to completion. So this secondary workflow due date reminder has completed, and just to verify, we can now have a look at the inbox of Brian, where you can see we have got a reminder: please review performance document Jeff performance report. So this is performance review which is due today for Brian. Now we have seen how to create a secondary workflow using SharePoint Designer. So in today's session, we talked about secondary workflow, how we can create secondary workflows with the help of SharePoint Designer, what is workflow template, what is workflow association, what is workflow instantiation, and how we can associate a workflow to a particular list or the task list. We have also seen a demonstration where we worked on an employee performance review library, where information workers or employees add their performance reviews in the library. And once the item is added to the performance library, which fires a primary workflow, and that primary workflow in turn fires a secondary workflow in the task list. So that was the sequence we considered in our demonstration. But there are a few points to remember while working with secondary workflows. When you are creating secondary workflow with the help of SharePoint Designer, make sure you have only SharePoint Designer primary workflow created. No other workflow like custom workflow created using Visual Studio.net can work with secondary workflow created using SharePoint Designer. Second thing to notice, a workflow running under system account cannot trigger a secondary workflow. And only one instance of workflow can run on a single list item at one time. So again, you cannot have multiple workflows expected to fire on a single list item. That was a small session on secondary workflow in SharePoint. Thanks for viewing.